Russia's war of aggression started in 2014 against Ukraine and has escalated significantly this year. But the attempts to control, coerce, and dominate Ukraine have far deeper roots. Today, I will examine the deep causes of the war, going back into Russia's imperialist past with one of the world's foremost experts on Russian international relations and politics. We will also explore how this conflict might end based on Russia's past military triumphs, defeats, and revolutions. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create and are interested in our fantastic guests, please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. I have great pleasure in introducing Andreas Umland, author, editor, academic, and prolific researcher in international relations, politics, and political science. You gained an MA in political science from Stanford University and a PhD in politics from the University of Cambridge. You have also lectured in Ukraine, Russia, and the UK. Andreas is a senior analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies and an analyst at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He's also editor of the publications Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society and Ukrainian Voices. It would probably take me an entire hour to list all of your accomplishments, so instead, let's dive straight into the questions. Andreas, before we talk about current events, I'd like to explore the ideological roots of this conflict. You wrote your PhD thesis on the rise of Alexander Dugin, the political philosopher that Putin is said to most admire. Would you class him as a thinker on the radical right of the political spectrum?
Yes, he's certainly on the radical right. I would even dare to call him a fascist. In the 1990s, he has actually admitted, more or less frankly, to being a fascist, but I wouldn't call him a sort of ideologist of the Kremlin or of Putin. I think he is a player in the Russian public realm. He is one of the people who has sort of prepared the Russian public for the current war and for earlier expansions and adventures by Russia. He's very active. He's extremely productive in terms of, writing books and producing videos and articles and whatnot. But he's not, to my knowledge, somebody who is directly connected to the Kremlin. And I would even suspect that the Kremlin sees him in a sort of ambivalent way because he's often rhetorically too strident. He had made these affirmative statements about fascism and even the Third Reich in the 1990s. So he would be actually a liability for the Kremlin if the Kremlin would include him in the sort of inner circle or make him an official of the Russian state apparatus. So my suspicion is also that he will probably remain in this sort of publicistic sphere and or semi-intellectual, or however you want to call it, sphere. But there he is certainly very active, and he's not quite a trivial figure, although I don't see his type of what he calls neo-Eurasianism actually being implemented. Putin also uses the term Eurasianism, and the Eurasian Economic Union uses the term, but the term is not necessarily linked to Dugin, at least not in the way that I guess most people in the Kremlin would see it. And Dugin is sort of within this sort of maintaining mainstream discourse now on the right fringe, I would say, and he is, like other extremist authors, also determining the overall discourse in Russia, although he's not right in the center of it.
And how does this compare to someone like Surkov, who was much more of a political animal who latched onto some of these ideas? And of course, he's now fallen out of favor as well, hasn't he?
Yes, you could say that Dugin is an actor in what sometimes is called meta politics. He's a sort of, it's about cultural hegemony, about the ruling concepts of society. He's engaged in this struggle. Surkov is actually a participant in actual politics and policies and has had various official positions And he is certainly, in a way, more interesting than others because he is also a sort of intellectual and a sort of writer, and he has some sort of interest in ideas and concepts and so on. But even with Surkov, I would say he never belonged to the inner circle of decision making. He was an instrument and a servant rather than a shaper of policies under Putin. And yeah, he now seems to be out of favor. Sometimes I think the reasons for these in and outs within the Kremlin may not actually have to do so much with politics or ideology, but there may be, struggles between sort of envious clans, or as they are sometimes called, towers, and then somebody comes in and somebody goes out, and we could overinterpret that as signaling something deeper. But my suspicion is that often there are actually no deep reasons for these appointments or for somebody being kicked out.
If you want to make a cheeky comparison, in the UK, you had Dominic Cummings, who was forced out because he argued with the Prime Minister's wife, apparently, rumored to be. Yeah. So it's these kind of struggles, personality struggles even, can determine stuff as much as politics. I'd like to ask a question about going back to Dugin and some of the core concepts behind Russia's expansionist war. One of these is the so-called Ruski Mir, or Russian world, or Russian peace, I guess you could call it as an oxymoron. What political architecture underpins the concept of Russian world, and why should this absolutely not become a template for future politics in Europe?
Well, it is a sort of mix of ethno-nationalism and pan-nationalism, actually something that we've also seen in other nationalisms, for instance, in German nationalism, that could be very ethnocentric, but it could be also pan-Germanic, it could be also racist. This sort of ambivalence we see in Russian nationalism here too, and we have this concept Russian world, and it can mean different things in different contexts. It can sometimes mean simply promoting Russian language and Russian culture abroad. It can mean returning territories of the former Tsarist and Soviet empires where Russian speakers live. It can mean special care about ethnic Russians. And with Ukraine, I think we have now actually a very specific sort of permutation of this Russian world concept, in that Ukraine is seen as little Russia, as a sort of a part of the Russian nation that has gone astray, and that now needs a special operation to be brought back to the mother. And therefore, I would even argue that perhaps this dubious term "special operation" has a deeper meaning, and is not just a cover-up for a war, but it actually means that there's an operation within the larger Russian nation. And what we are observing here is actually not an inter-ethnic conflict, but an intra-ethnic conflict, at least as it is seen from Moscow. So the argument that we have here from Moscow is that basically Ukrainians are Russians. They're somewhat different, perhaps something like Bavarians in Germany, and they've become infiltrated over the last decades, if not before, with all sorts of alien Western ideas: liberalism, Nazism, homosexuality, fascism, anti-Semitism, and all sorts of things. And now they have to be brought back into the Russian nation as via this special operation. And that is also, I think, I'm afraid, how at least some Russians see it, that they see, that they don't understand why Kiev would belong to NATO and to the European Union and not to a larger Russia. Perhaps the Ukrainians could be a separate state, but they can certainly not be an independent nation that sort of, because they are not a nation, basically. They are a part of the Russian nation. And that's why what they need is now this liberation, this cleansing operation this special operation in order to be brought back into the Russian world to which they always belonged, and where they now are sort of, for some reason, which they now trying to leave. Russian world is a very sort of fluid and flexible term that has been used in different ways. And some people are, when they have cooperated, let's say, with this foundation Russian world, which is functioning in Western countries, they found that unproblematic because this, let's say, this Russian World Foundation presents itself as sort of an equivalent of the British Council or the Goethe Institute or the Dante Institute or something like that. But in other contexts, it can mean very different things and can become actually very violent. It can become an almost, you could say, semi-fascist ideology if you think of this cleansing operation in Ukraine as actually something driven by an ideology that looks like fascism. If you see it in this Russian terms as an intra-ethnic and not an inter-ethnic conflict.
And of course, Putin, in some of his recent speeches, has used the word cleansing, not only to talk about taking over, that's not his language, obviously, but realigning Ukraine with Russia. He's also used that term when he's talking about the hundreds of thousands of middle-class Russians who fled the country. You know, those who are the potential backbone of its future high-tech economy. No one knows the precise figures. It's anything from hundreds of thousands to actually millions of educated professional Russians. And he just flippantly referred to that as cleansing non-Russian elements from the country.
Yes, you know, I would even dare to interpret that these are sort of also almost Ukrainians, these Russians that have left Russia and betrayed the motherland. And well, often many of them actually then also support Ukraine's independence and so on. Yes, so the violence is also internal. It's not just external. It's not just against Ukrainians, but it can become also ruthless in internal conflicts, killing simply the traitors inside the Russian Federation. And yeah, so this is actually, I've been for basically already 2 decades in a debate with various colleagues about whether and to which degree it makes sense to apply the term fascism to Russian phenomena. And until four months ago, I would have argued this is a term that can be, if you apply it carefully, used for Dugin, for instance. You could also conceptualize Zhirinovsky's ideology of a last dash to the south, which means a rebirth of Russia through a military operation, through the annexation of Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. That I would have argued that this is exclusively the sort of Russian fascism. You also have then, of course, lots of other varieties, paganism and neo-Nazism and whatnot. But these were the two most important elements of Russian fascism until I would say this year. But now with these new texts coming, or let's say last year, with these new texts coming out from Putin's mouth, from this publicist Sergeytsev, from even somebody who was once regarded as a sort of liberal, like Dmitry Medvedev, who has now become very strident in his rhetoric on Russia. This is now already, you know, this whole cleansing that you mentioned idea, and liberation and rebirth, and sort of creating a new Ukraine, if you like. That already looks sort of fascist to me, or at least proto-fascist or semi-fascist. So this is now, we are now actually in this field already, which is quite frightening, of course.
Absolutely. And you have a long experience of observing Russian politics and history going back more than 20 years. And I think you probably sort of traveled and lived there at a similar time than I did in the 90s, when there was a relative openness in culture and discussion. A lot of bitterness about the collapse of empire, of course, but people seem to be prepared to kind of move on. So have the events since February of this year surprised you at all? Or do they closely match historical, political, and cultural patterns in Russia of the past?
Well, I was afraid of this. That's why I wrote, in the 1990s, a master thesis on Zhirinovsky, then a dissertation on him, and then on Dugin, another dissertation. So, if I thought that these were marginal figures and non-entities and merely social or cultural phenomena, I'm a political science. I'm interested in politics and in power. And so I was worried about that. I agree with you. I was also in the 90s living in Russia. I was even working at the university there in the Urals, not just in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, in Yekaterinburg. And then things were still open. I think it was not predetermined, absolutely. At least not until then Putin was made prime minister in summer 1999. And I think now that I look back, I still had then, I had the hope that perhaps Putin would be somebody like Oleg Kalugin or Litvinenko, people who came out from out of the KGB, but who turned out to be actually, human beings and, with a good analytical mind and a sober judgment and so on.
Like Gordievsky, Mitrokhin,
yes,
others like that. Yeah.
Actually, yes, there are actually quite a lot of them. Well, not a lot, but at least some of them. So, and the noise that Putin was making in 1999 and 2000, 2001 was sort of ambivalent. Sometimes it sounded already a little bit suspicious, but there were other interviews where he's sort of, against totalitarianism, against, he was sort of, I remember he was sort of asked about, annexation of Crimea. He said, no, this has been solved. We've been, we had agreed, nothing could be more wrong to assume that Russia wants to annex Crimea. So, but now I think that was actually theater. I'm actually following here rather the line of Catherine Belton's book, who thought this was basically, to come back to the term we used at the beginning, a special operation. That these Putin and others, they were sort of, schmoozing with the Democrats in order to regain power. And once they then had power, then they started basically implementing what had been always their ideas. And so I think with the appointment of Putin, I think the chance was gone for further democratization, for sort of better development, unfortunately. Because now the violence that we now see, and actually we could already see that even in 1999 with the apartment bombings in Moscow and in other cities, with the Second Chechen War, the kind of ruthlessness that was there, that was also already very suspicious back then. So yeah, I think it was open in the 1990s. It was not necessarily predetermined. Some people say, I've just listened to a lecture from a German historian I very much admire, Jan Klaas Behrens, who says that basically the whole thing started already in 1993 with the shooting of the parliament and so on. Yes, there was already this sort of, especially the first Chechen war was a departure, I would say. I wouldn't see the events in October 1993 as critical, because the violence was not actually started by Yeltsin, but the violence was started from the side of the Supreme Soviet, and then Yeltsin had to respond with somehow, and then he called in the tanks, and that was obviously bad. But he didn't have much choice, in my opinion, at that point. With the first Chechen war, I think he had a choice. That was a terribly wrong decision. And then, with there was already some deterioration, but it wasn't predetermined that we would end up where we are now. I think the the crucial failure of Yeltsin was choosing Putin as his successor.
Yes, and that stored up a lot of issues for the future, which are now unfolding. And turning to that sort of transition period, that long transition period between 2000 and the present, I see from your CV that you're a member of the Valdez discussion club between 2010 and 2013. And for those unfamiliar with it, the Valdez Club is a Russian organization that has a mission to foster global dialogue about Russia and provide independent, unbiased scholarly analysis of political, economic, and social processes in Russia. Now, obviously, there's no forum these days for that kind of open discussion. But could you describe the club then, and how has that forum become degraded? Because the years you were part of it intersected with that infamous Bolotnaya protests that were brutally suppressed, and democratic voices, I think, got their very clear answer in 2012 that there was, no possible evolutionary development of democracy in Russia. From the position of being a member of that club, did you notice these major changes taking place?
Well, my sort of membership in this club, if one could call it that way, was merely a participation in one meeting of this club in 2010. I was invited there apparently because I had written a hopeful sort of article about Medvedev, who looked back then, as I called him, like a possible second Gorbachev. Yeah, so he could perhaps, in a different constellation, been a democratizer. Back then, the noise that Medvedev was making was actually pretty good. I mean, that was basically liberal democratic ideology. Now he has become very strange, and he seems to, he's said to have an alcohol problem. But back then he was sort of raising some hope, not only with me. And then they invited me to this Valdez Club meeting, and that was it basically. And then they asked me for a couple of articles, or they made interviews with me, and but that, I mean, I wasn't very prolific in this club. I was basically sitting at this meeting that we had back in 2010 on the sidelines, listening to what was happening there, and I was not an act. I mean, there are others who went there over years, for every year, or perhaps even twice or 3 times per year to meetings of this club. I was just for one meeting there. Yeah, I mean, that was in that time, it wasn't yet quite clear, what would come out of this Medvedev presidency. Yeah, I mean, I was sort of, I think I maybe still listed on the website actually of the Valdez Club as a supposed. This was not inhibiting me in writing my very critical articles about Putin and so on. So, and I'm generally known in Russia as a Russophobe, which I'm not, but that's another story. But that's how I'm by the official media called there. Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a sort of a forum, or perhaps it still exists. I don't know, for the West, for Western scholars to get some impression, to get some direct meetings with high-standing Russian officials, including with Putin himself. I was at such a meeting in Yalta in 2010, where Putin was present. And for the Kremlin, it was basically a sort of an attempt to influence Western public opinion. The various Kremlin officials could then sort of, voice their ideas there, and there were different people in this club. There were some very critical, some were obviously sort of more on the Putin line, and yeah, I mean, I found it actually interesting, this meeting that I went to. So they were very different. From Alexander Prokhanov was there, and I still regret not having actually spoken to him. I was sort of, I mean, he's also, I think, a fascist, and I didn't feel very comfortable in his presence, but I should have taken the advantage of speaking to him.
Asking
Exactly.
some direct questions. And it's also true to say, isn't it, that until recently, relatively recently, there were a number of, not necessarily critical, but there were liberal voices within the government. There were liberal economists functioning within the regime. I mean, certainly until 2012, and even, I believe, until 2019, there were some sort of vestiges of that left. So there does seem to have been a significant change with the Siloviki taking more and more control until we see 2019 and the Belarusification of Russian politics. I mean, all those voices have now been completely driven out, haven't they?
Yeah. The first years, there was actually still this sort of, basically until the end of the Medvedev presidency, there was still a certain pluralism, and there were different people in the leadership, and these different sort of, I would say, even there was a sort of a liberal clan, you could say, with basically Medvedev leading it. And there's, for instance, Andrei Ilarionov, the economic advisor of Putin during the first presidency of Putin, who is now living in Ukraine, actually, and is sort of one of the major voices of Russian anti-Putinist voices in Ukraine. And there were others. But that was always, I think this potential was always there. That was unfortunately this sort of Weimar syndrome that Russia already had in the 1990s. And like Weimar, the Weimar Republic in Germany was not necessarily leading to German fascism. Also, the post-Soviet Russian situation in the 1990s was not bound to lead to what we now have. I'm not yet sure whether to apply the term fascism to the entire Russian regime and to the basically entire edifice of Russian ideas that are now sort of governing Russia. But for the operation with regard to Ukraine, I think that already reminds a lot of the sort of policies and also of the ideas of classical fascism.
And talking to Ian Garner, amongst others, they've pointed out that there are a number of changes happening in society. For instance, the revival of the pioneers, which was announced, I think, last week, which was the sort of Soviet-era youth movement. You've also had mass changes to textbooks, which are along, I would say, well, Soviet fascist kind of lines, rewriting history on rather sort of nationalist lines, and in some instances even taking Ukraine entirely out. I think it's no coincidence that one of the largest warehouses of the textbook publisher was burnt down, I think, near Moscow by that sort of partisan resistance in the early months of the war. Is the tendency towards that sort of fascism within society and building the architecture of a fascist state?
As I said, I wouldn't yet call Russia a fascist state, because the main sort of domestic ideology and doctrine seems to be that basically Russia is fine. The sort of and that was of course very different from when Mussolini and Hitler came to power. They wanted to revolutionize their societies. So for the sort of domestic ideology of Putin, I think that is basically, it's now turning out to be something like neo-Stalinism. It's basically reviving the repressive policies and ideas and practices of the Soviet regime. And then the most repressive ones were those under Stalin, and also partly of the Tsarist regime, because the Tsarist regime was also towards political opposition quite. It's a sort of mixture of these ideas, and there's a certain new language around it, like, for instance, the talk about Eurasianism, Eurasian Economic Union. That is something that is new to Russia, this terminology, Eurasianism. So, but within Russian society, yes, you always, actually you had already in the 1990s a certain fascist camp, you could say, a certain part of Russian nationalism that was actually infatuated also with Western fascist ideas. Dugin was perhaps the main translator here and the main communicator of these Western fascist ideas. And now you have a sort of a domestic fascism emerging, but I think that is not yet something that is representative of the whole Russian state. Because the general impulse of Putin and people like him seems to be conservative rather than revolutionary or ultra-conservative or reactionary or restorationist. It's rather looking to the past than revolutionizing the present and creating a new Russia. The new Russia has to emerge in Ukraine, Novorossiya. Yeah, that's there. He wants to create a new little Russia, so to say. And that is why I now actually think about applying the term fascism to this particular part of the Russian policies that we see as foreign policies, but actually that are seen in Russia as almost domestic policies. Because, as I said, the Russian leadership and many in Russia, unfortunately, see Ukraine as a part of Russia, and the Ukrainians as a part of the Russian nation that need to be re-educated, liberated, cleansed, and so on.
And the regimes that have been set up in the Donbass areas and the attempts to set them up in newly conquered areas, I mean, they're not independent administrations, are they? They are essentially puppet administrative units consisting of
Yes,
military, secret service, terror, etc. But they're totally controlled from the center, aren't they?
Yes, and there has been a debate in the sort of Ukrainian studies community about the role of domestic factors in the emergence of these so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. I belong to those who think that this would not have happened without Russian intervention. And there was a part of society on Crimea and in the Donbass that was perhaps more allegiant to Russia, Russian-speaking and also culturally Russian. But that was in Crimea, I would say, about half, perhaps, of Crimea's population, and in the Donbass about a third of the 1/3 of the population. But even these people, and there's been some interesting research, qualitative research on Crimea before the annexation by, I think her name is Eleanor Knott from the London School of Economics, who has conducted interviews, deeper, longer interviews, and who found that even among those who were most pro-Russian, most anti-Ukrainian, there was no actually appetite for secession and for annexation, because they were sort of settled. They were not particularly happy with the situation, but they had settled basically within the Ukrainian state. And in the Donbass, of course, that was even less so the case. And there's now research actually by people like Nikolai Mitrokhin, a researcher who comes from Russia, who lives already for many years in Germany, and by a German PhD candidate, or now PhD, Jakob Pauter, who have researched the beginnings of this so-called Donbass rebellion, the Opolchenia, and they found actually a lot of evidence that this Girkin group that was smuggled into eastern Ukraine from Crimea was not just a group dominated by Russian citizens, but that this group was also in close contact with the Russian state. And what is important here is, and Girkin has said, that Ukrainians didn't want to fight. I had to start the war. I had to pull the trigger. But the important thing here is that he was in contact with Russian state organs when he was doing that. He was not just on his own. He was not like an adventurer, like a simply irregular fighter who was on his own. He was actually in connection with Russian state organs. And that's why I think, the entire, and that is something that unfortunately, even many in the West and unfortunately most in Russia don't want to acknowledge, that this is not an a civil war. This has not started as a civil war. It has never been a civil war. It was always either more hidden or less hidden. It was something generated and ruled and governed from Moscow. These are just puppet regimes, and they are now stuffed with Ukrainians, with Ukrainian citizens or former Ukrainian citizens, one should perhaps say. So the Russians are not ethnic Russians, and Russian citizens are not playing, as in 2014, a dominant role anymore. But these are clearly puppet units, puppet entities.
That's right, and bringing to bear the power of the state, the economy. Obviously, we can't know all of the money that changed hands, all the incentives that were provided to people to organize in that way. But I have no doubt that you can't make all this happen using traditional Russian apathy and no resources and materials. There would have been, I think, some fairly strong financial incentives for people to organize in this way and fight under guidance. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, you bring up Ukraine and this fantastic research that is going on, which is little known, but you are a close observer of the evolution of the Ukrainian party system, aren't you, before and after Euromaidan? And of course, there's been this long 8-year war as the precursor to the current conflict. So how has the parliamentary and political system evolved in Ukraine over that time?
Well, unfortunately, the entire 30 years of Ukrainian history extremely volatile. So you have parties coming in and out all the time. For about 20 years, the only stable element of the Ukrainian party system was the Communist Party until it was kicked out of parliament in the 2014 elections. And then afterwards, also in connection with the decommunization campaign, banned, actually. But that was after it was kicked out of parliament. I think that is something important here about the disappearance of the Communist Party to remember. But even this party has now disappeared, and we have now this volatility, perhaps out of the currently two dominating blocs, namely Zelensky's Servant of the People Party and the European Solidarity Party, and also the Fatherland Party of Tymoshenko and the European Solidarity Party of Poroshenko. Something maybe like a two-party system could emerge. I would not exclude that, perhaps also with the far right again getting into parliament in the next elections, although they got in the last elections, the united far right got only 2.1%. But perhaps they will now get over 5% again. Then we would perhaps sort of have a three-party system. So it's difficult to say what will come out of this war in terms of party politics, because now many things are changing. The population simply is changing. People are leaving the country, people are dying, and also the coordinates of the entire society are changing. The cultural coordinates, the industrial coordinates, the infrastructure. So I'm not sure where we will come out of this politically at the end of the story. And some people have been afraid that there might be a sort of authoritarian trend. I also see these tendencies. There's certainly now a centralization of power. But on the whole, if you look on the history of post-Soviet Ukraine, it has always been relatively pluralistic. Even in the worst years of Kuchma and Yanukovych, it was actually pretty more pluralistic than Putin's Russia, I would argue. So I would think that once we have a ceasefire and peace, there will be again a lot of pluralism, a lot of opposition, and perhaps the dividing line will be this between this sort of more centrist ideology of the servant of the people, if you can call it an ideology already. It's a young party, so it's still sort of shaping itself, which is not unusual, by the way. The young parties usually need some time to determine themselves and to become consolidated. And then you have the older organizations like Poroshenko's European Solidarity Party or the Fatherland Party Unite, because they are very close ideologically. Who knows? It's difficult to say now what will domestically happen, because all of society is now, of course, concentrated on the war. And there's very little sort of internal politics going on now.
And of course, millions of Ukrainians are now scattered over Europe largely. They're experiencing Western societies, living with families, understanding how the news works here. They're also seeing that sort of corruption doesn't really exist on a day-to-day level in people's lives. I mean, it's not to say there is no corruption in Europe, but it's at a different level, and doesn't necessarily prevent people from working and living. I assume that it's very unpredictable when those millions return, whether that be next year or the year after. They're going to take experiences and values with them that will change society and the attitude to politics as well.
Yes, who knows? I mean, the question will be also how many will then return. I'm afraid that many may actually stay. They may find their ways into the labor market, and then once they've gone through all these bureaucratic procedures of getting registered and somewhere to live and school places and so on, some of them may decide to stay, but some will return. Some are actually already returning. So, for instance, the population of Kiev has grown again. The more peaceful regions are becoming repopulated already. So, and perhaps this will also have an effect, their experience in the West, or at least in Poland. Most of them went, of course, not to Western Europe, but to Eastern Europe, and they did not get even as far as Germany. So that will also change, perhaps, political outlooks in Ukraine. In a strange way, Putin has pushed with this operation also the European integration of Ukraine. That we have now the candidate status. We have now many emigres, Ukrainian emigres in the European Union, and we will have apparently a large program of reconstruction once we have a ceasefire, and there's a lot of planning already now going on about the reconstruction.
Absolutely. I think that reconstruction, that conference that happened last week is absolutely fascinating. But what happens if the war does not end cleanly? If there's a sort of North Korea style scenario with a big part of Ukrainian land not under its control, how might that affect future Ukrainian statehood and block that reconstruction and transformation of Ukraine into a modern European integrated state?
It depends. I think it does not necessarily have to mean, depending, of course, on the exact frame of the ceasefire and what kind of territory then eventually will remain under Russian control. It does not have to be a principal impediment. I'm afraid it will, in the near future, be difficult for Ukraine to regain all of its territory. I'm afraid at least Crimea and perhaps also the so-called People's Republics, the territories that they had until 23rd of February this year, will perhaps remain for longer under Russian control. But that does not have to mean a principal problem. One could imagine a dynamic development for the right moment to regain back its lost territories, as was the case in Germany, with West Germany, for instance, that waited for a long time, but eventually then was reunified with East Germany. I come from East Germany. I'm part of this. I was once part of this process. So if Ukraine can get a ceasefire and can get most of its territories back, and if then it gets enough support, then all of this will be possible. I think the main question here is, for me, when the West will understand that it has to, before actually thinking about rebuilding Ukraine, it has to make Ukrainian territory secure. And there are two ways to do that. One, which is my preferred way, some sort of real security guarantees for Ukraine from Western countries. The ideal form to get that would, of course, be the accession to NATO, which is probably not possible. Actually, the accession to the EU also would already be quite a lot of gain, in terms of security. But that is perhaps also not for the next years possible. But you could also imagine some other new security arrangement for Ukraine. But I'm afraid that will not happen. Actually, that even countries like Great Britain, that is seen now in Ukraine as one of the biggest friends of Ukraine, will not go as far as actually to committing sending troops to Ukraine in the case of a new escalation. So I think the only way out here is really to arm Ukraine, to heavily arm Ukraine, to make it a sort of second Israel. The Israeli model that is often spoken about in Ukraine now, that Ukraine basically gets so strong militarily that it can actually deter Russia. And then you could start with rebuilding, really. I think you can also now start already, but then the risk is of course always that you build something and then it's destroyed again. So I think arming Ukraine is not just something that Ukraine needs now for the current battles that it's fighting, but it's also a strategic decision because if Ukraine does not get into a major security arrangement, then how can it defend itself? It can only defend itself by itself, and then it needs the material to effectively do so.
And giving Ukraine the material to defend itself almost implies that we need to deny Russia the material and revenue it needs to rearm himself. But isn't there a fundamental problem here? If Russia sticks to the imperialist concept of its spheres of influence over its former dominions and its near abroad, then you have almost like a Orwellian standoff with perpetual struggle over that front line.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the prospect now. I mean, the hope is here always that at some point the population will understand how expensive these foreign adventures are going to be, and that, well, they got Crimea, but that will be a very expensive gain, and the price for Crimea and for the other Ukrainian territories will be extremely high. And the price will be rising as the sanctions take more and more effect. So, and then perhaps we will actually get to a situation that people will say, why we need trade, we need, development, we need economic investment, and so on. Why do we need Crimea? So I think we will get to this point at some point, but as long as Putin is alive, I think we will be in the standoff.
And I think that's probably a good place to ask the final question here, and that very much relates to what you've just said. So Russian propaganda seeks to exude strength, power, and certainty, but isn't it more symptomatic of the inadequacies of Putin's regime, the system he's created, its weakness and its lack of vision? And some people have even claimed that Russia is potentially so fragile that it could fragment and collapse in the coming years.
Yes, that could happen. Especially, I think here a candidate is the Northern Caucasus. And I guess actually many Russians wouldn't mind getting rid of the Northern Caucasus. With the other territories, I'm not so sure whether there could be fragmentation. I wouldn't exclude it, but that is less certain for me, and it's also perhaps not something that we should wish for, fragmentation of Russia, because that would then, with the nuclear material and so on, that could create new risks, even also for Ukraine, new risks. So that is perhaps not something we should be working for, although many in Ukraine would now, of course, prefer a fragmented Russia, but that's perhaps even it could be even worse than the current Russian Federation in a very bad apocalyptic scenario. Actually, here what comes in is a very strange sort of Ukrainian model for Russia, namely Ukraine's decentralization over the last 8 years, because Ukraine has conducted a decentralization that is good for preventing secessionism, because it transfers power not to the regions, but to the municipalities. It is a sort of municipalization, you could call it, to the communes, to the cities, to the villages, to so-called amalgamated territorial communities, as they are called in Ukraine. And that would be something that I think could also be for Russia a way to prevent its fragmentation, because then you would transfer power not only away from the center, but also away from the oblast capitals. You would actually transfer it down to local communities, and local communities cannot secede. They cannot create their own states. And then you would have the centers of power there, and then that would actually hold the country together. That is something that actually could be exported, if you like, from Ukraine to Russia, this decentralization as a municipalization, not as a federalization, which could become a sort of a Balkanization or Bosnification of Russia, but a municipalization where you would have then strong local communities and basically the center only taking care of some basic functions, and then Russia could remain reunited in this way. And I think this a decentralized, municipalized Russia would be basically a non-imperial Russia, because these local communities would not have interest in financing foreign adventures.
That creation of accountability then could perhaps turn Russia into a better neighbor for Ukraine. Do you think also creating this local accountability would help to build civil society and the rule of law, which is one of the reasons why we're at where we are, that total lack of accountability within the Russian political system?
Yes, that these are also the problems. But here I think the Ukrainians who are more skeptical have a point in that they say, well, maybe corruption is not so bad for the Russian state, because that is sort of making the Russian state less effective, and that sort of is good for Ukraine if the Russian state is less effective. And I'm also not sure that as sort of a stronger civil society and more accountability will actually by itself already reduce Russian imperialism. You need more sort of, because unfortunately you have these imperial instincts very widely spread. We saw that with the annexation of Crimea, when basically most of the Russian nation was drunk by the annexation. We had these strange opinion polls that were showing that after the annexation, Russians thought of the Russian state as being less corrupt than before the annexation. Although it was, of course, not less, it did not become less corrupt. It was just the grass became greener, the sky became bluer, when the annexation happened. So, so I think one would need a whole array of policies to somehow reduce this sort of Russian imperial impulse. Education, civil society, accountability, decentralization, privatization, and so on, and to then create a modern society that would not be living in these myths of, empire and national greatness, and would be just, dealing with everyday local problems. And there are lots of them, of course, in Russia. That's quite a task. Actually, here, Ukraine could become a model for Russia and also for other post-Soviet republics once they start re-democratizing. At some point, I think that will happen, and then there could be certain templates like the decentralization of Ukraine taken, or the anti-corruption institutions and so on, that could be then readapted to Belarus, to the Central Asian republics, to Azerbaijan, to Ukraine. They could then look for, not only to Ukraine, but also to Ukraine for templates with which to make their countries more effective.
And that, I believe, is the real reason behind the war. I have had as I'm sure you have, endless arguments with people about whether NATO is culpable for the war or is the main cause of the war. I actually think what you've just mentioned there is the main reason why Putin's gone to war. It's so that there isn't a template on his doorstep for a well-run, evolving democracy with these institutions that provide examples to the Russian population to follow.
Yes, and to return to this NATO argument, we have now actually the materialized counterfactual with the accession of Finland to NATO. So now the NATO border doubles once Finland becomes a member of NATO. And what's happening? Moscow is saying, okay, so we now have twice as much border with NATO as we had before. So what, And if you look at the map, Putin's hometown, St. Petersburg, could be now attacked from two sides, from Estonia and from Finland, and perhaps be taken by NATO within days. But so what, Putin doesn't seem to care much.
He knows the reality that
this whole argument about.
I mean, he knows NATO wouldn't have conducted an aggressive.
Sorry,
war.
I didn't get that.
Sorry, he knows NATO wouldn't have conducted an aggressive war to take St. Petersburg.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So he doesn't really care about it, and and now NATO is really becoming very close. And they seem to be fine with it. They are concerned about Ukraine, which is not getting into NATO, and they care more about Moldova, which has actually in 1994 excluded NATO membership in its constitution, but that is more of concern to them than Finland, that is now becoming a member of NATO.
Well, Andreas, there are a million more questions that I would like to ask you, but unfortunately, our time is up. It's been a huge pleasure speaking with you, and I'm very grateful that you have spent so much of your precious time to be interviewed this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was an honor.